Hello there, RotoBallers. I'm Matt Donnelly, and this is your must-start, must-sit list for week number 10 at the running back position. This video is being recorded on Monday, so plenty can still happen between now and Sunday's kickoff, so make sure you are tuned in to RotoBaller.com and our RotoBaller Discord channel for all the latest fantasy football news. Now let's get into it here. Let's talk running backs, and let's talk about Breece Hall versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Vegas has allowed over 31 fantasy points per game to opposing backs over the last 4 weeks. Last week, it was Saquon Barkley who ran for 90 yards on 16 carries while catching 3 passes for 23 additional yards. Detroit, the week before, had Jahmyr Gibbs average 5.8 yards per carry on his way to a 152-yard performance on the ground with a touchdown, along with 37 more yards and 5 grabs. Let's go back one more week here. Let's go back to D'Onta Foreman, where he produced 3 touchdowns and 120 total yards. I know we're talking week 10, but heading into week number 9, it was Breece Hall who led the league in yards per carry, which is not going to go well for the Raiders this week. Fans don't want to hear this. Managers don't really want to hear this if you're going against Breece Hall. The only person possibly capable of stopping Breece Hall is probably Arthur Smith. Don't be afraid to start Rachaad White this week against the Tennessee Titans. It used to be you didn't start running backs against this Titans defense. Well, that narrative has changed, especially as this season has matured. In the last 4 weeks, Tennessee is allowing over 22.5 fantasy points per game, which is inside the top 12 amongst fantasy points yielded by position. Najee Harris and Jaylen Warren ran for 157 yards and caught 5 passes for 182. White, he's not your typical running back. He really isn't. Look at him. He's like a wide receiver who lines up in the backfield. In that shootout against the Texans, he hauled in all 4 of his targets for 36 yards, and then he added 73 yards on the ground on 20 attempts. White has now seen 4 or more targets in 4 straight contests, while seeing a 73% of the running back opportunities in Tampa Bay there in week number 9. That kind of usage simply cannot be ignored. Another start this week. You're starting David Montgomery once again this week, and I've waited too long to plug him back in there. And you know what? He's bringing his friends along with him. Center Frank Ragnow, guard Jonah Jackson. I'm expecting this to be a big-time week for him. I'm also expecting that Jahmyr Gibbs is going to have a larger role this week than he had previously when Montgomery was healthy. But the Chargers, hey, they're all about sharing. They've allowed more than 23 fantasy points per game to backs this season. And you know that Dan Campbell is going to want to establish the run, especially with all these players returning to his lineup. Let's not forget that Montgomery, even though he's missed 3 games this season, he's still responsible for 39% of the Lions' carries this season. That's more than Bijan Robinson. One more start this week. How about Ramondre Stevenson versus the Indianapolis Colts? Only the Carolina Panthers are allowing more rushing touchdowns per game than the Indianapolis Colts. Indy is allowing 1.7 rushing yards per game and over 25 fantasy points per game to running backs. The Colts, they played the Panthers backs well last week, but they did allow 8 receptions to the position there in week number 9, and they have allowed 44 this season. Last week, Stevenson looked like he was back, catching 4 passes for 42 yards and a touchdown. He also recorded 87 yards on the ground on just 9 carries. Let's go, Stevenson. You're about the only offense we can trust there in New England. Now to the sit list. And it's Jerome Ford versus the Baltimore Ravens. The Ravens are allowing less than 9 fantasy points per game this season in fantasy and under 92 rushing yards per game on the season. And in the last 3 weeks, that number drops to less than 81 rushing yards per game. If you were starting a Browns back this week, you're probably better off turning your attention to Kareem Hunt in PPR formats. Look no further than last week when the Ravens defense held Seahawks back Kenneth Walker to just 16 yards on 9 carries and just 1.7 fantasy points. With Isaiah Pacheco, Raheem Mostert, and DeAndre Swift all on their buys this week, you may be tempted, but you're better off parking this Ford for at least 1 week. My second running back to sit this week, he's not a Ford, but he is a bust. I'm sitting Gus Edwards versus Cleveland. Look, I'm playing the matchup here. Edwards, he has been one of the top backs in fantasy over the last 3 weeks. He's found the end zone on 6 different occasions, with 5 of those occurring over the last 2 weeks. I know you want to roll with the hot hand here, but I cannot recommend it against this Browns defense that is 6th in rushing yards allowed per game and 4th in fantasy points surrendered to backs this season. Back in week number 4, Edwards would average just 3.2 yards per carry, which was his 2nd lowest mark of the season, and just 48 yards. As good as Edwards has been the last few weeks, the Browns defense has been this good all season long. And my final sit of the week is Alexander Mattison versus the New Orleans Saints. This is a fade for me, people. You'd think that an Achilles injury to Cam Akers would probably project Madison up a little bit higher into my sit list. No, not so much. That's exactly what the most frustrating back in all of fantasy would want you to believe. New Orleans, they are top 5 in fantasy when it comes to limiting opposing running backs for fantasy purposes. Well, Joshua Dobbs was a nice story last week. The Vikings, they did lose another pass catcher there in KJ Osborne. New Orleans, they're going to be able to lock up Jordan Addison on the outside with Marshawn Lattimore. TJ Hawkinson is going to end up seeing bracket coverage, which means they'll be able to direct the rest of their resources to shutting down Alexander Madison. Now, what you don't want to shut down is this RotoBaller YouTube channel, so make sure you hit that like button. Make sure you subscribe for all the latest fantasy football analysis.